Welcome to the Coming Home Well podcast, the show that educates, supports, and advocates for the veteran community. Your host, Dr. Tyler Piron, U.S. Army retired, will bring you exciting conversations with amazing guests about resources, research, and military history, all geared to helping our warriors to come home well. Here's your host, Dr. Tyler Piron.
Welcome back to Coming Home Well. I'm your host, Tyler Piron, and today we are going to delve into something that I love, which is history. And more specifically, we're going to talk about the Cold War. And if you're of a certain age, maybe a little bit older than I am, you know all about the Cold War. It's everything after World War II till about the 90s, the early 90s. I mean, it was like a crazy time of intense tensions between different countries, and there's been millions of books written and articles in the newspapers and everything else about the Cold War. And all of a sudden, everything opens up and everybody has sort of forgotten about it because generations change. Now, it has dramatically changed our country. The Cold War created so many things in the environment. There's been so many books written about how the international relations changed. But there was also something very interesting that was going on. It was a lot of spying on each other. There's a million stories out there about all the things, all the spy novels, all the movies. But sometimes even real life is even more interesting than the movies and the books that you can go read, which are the result of some, writer's fiction. Real life is even crazier than that. And to get towards that, we have an awesome guest. It is Francis Gary Powers Jr. And if you don't know what that name means, that's fine, because we're gonna get that out. But if you're of a certain age, a little bit older than me, you're gonna go, "Oh, I know exactly what that's all about." You probably don't, and that's what we're gonna get into partially, because there's a lot of times people, they form initial memories, and the reality is a lot different. So, welcome to the show, Gary. Thank you so much for joining us on Coming Home Well.
All right, Tyler, thanks for having me on.
So I alluded to it a little bit. You're Gary Powers. Your dad was Francis Gary Powers. What is your dad famous for?
So Dad was one of the first U-2 pilots back in the 1950s, flying for the CIA in an airplane called the U-2, built by Lockheed Skunk Works. The U-2 program was implemented because Eisenhower, at the time, our president, needed to find out the strengths and weaknesses of our adversaries, primarily the Soviet Union. At the time in the 1950s, Khrushchev is the premier of the Soviet Union. He's boasting about his missiles. He's bragging about his bombers. He is trying to intimidate the United States. So Eisenhower authorizes the implementation of a U-2 program. It's headed up by the CIA. They build this airplane in about 8 months under budget with a slide rule back in the 1950s. Its first flight is in 1956, July 4th, over Moscow. Khrushchev complains. The U.S. goes, "What spy plane? We don't know what you're talking about. Once you shoot one down or once you capture one, talk to us." At the time, we were just playing the cat and mouse game of espionage. My dad, one of the U-2 pilots flying these missions, was gathering photographic intelligence. He was taking photographs of air bases, submarine bases, military industrial complexes, the tarmacs with the MiGs and the bombers on it, trying to find out the strengths and weaknesses of our adversaries. So after 4 years of successful flights between 1956 and May 1st of 1960, my father is on a mission flying over the Soviet Union when one of 8 SA-2 missiles explode behind the tail section. It causes structural failure. He's hit at his assigned altitude of 70,500 feet. He bails out of the airplane. He parachutes to the ground. He's captured. He's interrogated by the KGB for 3 months. He's put on a trial, a show trial, where he's found guilty of espionage and sentenced to 10 years in prison. After serving a total of 21 months, he's exchanged for Soviet spy Colonel Rudolf Abel at the Glienicke Bridge in Potsdam, Germany. That exchange was recently depicted in the Steven Spielberg movie called Bridge of Spies. So that is a very quick overview of why Dad is in the history books and why we're talking about the Cold War today.
So the U-2, and this is just such a marvel of engineering, and it goes back to, there's all these movies. 70,000 feet in the 50s is like beyond any imagination. I mean, that is so high, and it's going so fast. How in the world were they able to shoot it down?
Well, at first, for the first 4 years, they could not reach that altitude. Their missiles could not get past 60,000 feet, the SA-1 missiles. But over 4 years of research and development, the Soviets improved their weapon system. They made an SA-2 missile that could now reach 70,000 feet and above. And on May 1st, the missiles were in the right place. Dad was in the wrong place, and he shot down out of the sky.
So your dad gets caught. There's all sorts of things going on. This is back in the old days of the CIA, where they would go and spin yarns about everything. Everything was not nearly as well planned. It was much more cavalier and cowboy at the time. And so they were like, what do we do with the pilot that's been caught in a plane on the ground? And the Soviets are able to go through and start examining all the pieces. Foreign material exploitation is what the intelligence community calls it today, but it's the exact same thing as what they're doing back then. So what the heck were they doing?
Well, the Soviets were trying to figure out how the plane could fly so high and what type of equipment it had on board. So after the plane was shot down, it crashed into the ground, everything's broken, the camera lenses are broken, the camera film is unwound. It's just, a big mess. But they are able to assemble it. They put it on display in Gorky Park. They have their top scientists come in and look at the gizmos and the gadgets. They have my father walk down next to the pieces of the plane, ask him questions about the equipment. He basically lies to him and says, I don't know what this does. I'm just a pilot. And so he was able to keep quite a bit of information out of Soviet hands by playing dumb. The Soviets go through and try to figure out what the equipment does. The radar, the destruct button, the different components for relays of signals, trying to figure out what is this thing doing, how is it operating, can we reverse engineer the technology to make something similar. So that's what they were trying to do once the wreckage was in their hands.
So this was a big deal on the international stage. Obviously they got caught, flying over the Soviet Union, shot it down. It was a public relations coup for the Soviets and a black eye on the U.S. And then eventually your dad gets exchanged. What happened next?
Well, let me back up just a moment in regards to what Dad went through before he was exchanged. He is interrogated by the KGB, 16-hour days, bright spotlight, grueling questions, threats of death, no physical torture. He was too high profile a prisoner. The world knew that the Soviets had captured Francis Gary Powers. So they wanted to use this as a pawn. My dad is a pawn. They wanted to come out to looking better than the U.S., make themselves look better, embarrass the United States. Dad is put on trial, a 3-day show trial at the Hall of Columns in downtown Moscow. There he is sentenced to 10 years in prison. He starts to serve this sentence in Vladimir prison, 3 hours outside of Moscow. There, for the next 18 months, he's incarcerated with a cellmate that speaks English, about 6 other languages. He's Latvian. My father thinks he's a plant. Even though they get along and they help each other endure the hardship, there's always this little nagging question in the back of Dad's head, who is this guy? I bet he can remember everything I say. So they did get along. They had a friendship. They helped each other endure the hardship. But my dad was always a little concerned as to why he was in the same jail cell with him. Mm-hmm. After a total of 20 in captivity, Dad is exchanged at the Glennecker Bridge, Potsdam, Germany. Cold, dark, foggy morning, right out of a John Le Carré novel. 2 spies on each side of the Glennecker Bridge. They're positively ID'd. They walk home to their respective freedoms. When my father returns home, he is shocked to discover that there are people out there that think he's, failed the country. While my father was incarcerated, all sorts of editorials, opinion pieces in the press and the magazines were released, basically saying that my father defected. He landed the plane intact. He spilled his guts and told the Soviets everything he knew, or that he hadn't followed orders. all of which were mistruths, untruths, some innuendos of the time. Dad was extensively debriefed by the CIA. After 3 weeks of debriefing, they realized he did everything he was supposed to do. He followed his orders to the T. He is exonerated by the CIA. He then appears before a Senate Select Committee hearing in Washington, D.C. The senators are asking him questions back and forth, about 2 hours of the hearing. What happened? How were you shot down? What information did you tell them? Did you tell them anything of importance? The senators are trying to get to the bottom of what took place. After the 2-hour session, they give my father a standing ovation. They call him a brave young man performing well under dangerous circumstances. But all the while, he's now been cleared by the CIA. He's been cleared by the U.S. Senate, but he's not been cleared by the court of public opinion. That's because of all the fake news of the time, saying he defected, landed the plane, collaborated with the enemy, etc. So my father did brush that off. It didn't bother him. He didn't care what other people thought he should or should not have done. He knew that what he did was the right thing to do. He goes on to work for the CIA for another year at their headquarters in McLean, Virginia. He's training agents on what to do if captured, how to go through an interrogation, how to appear to cooperate, but you're never giving the enemy any information of value. After he leaves the CIA, he gets a job with Lockheed Aircraft Corporation as a U-2 test pilot, flying the U-2s out of Burbank, California. Has that job between 1963 and 1970. In 70, he writes his book, Operation Overflight. That's his account of the U-2 incident and what he had gone through. He's on the lecture circuit the next 2 years, between 70 and 72. Then he gets another pilot job, flying for KGIL radio station in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles. He is flying basically news, weather, traffic reporting in a Cessna 172 over the LA basin. 4 years later, he gets a job with NBC television in 1976. He's flying their helicopter, again, reporting on news, weather, and traffic, but this time for the evening news. August 1st, 1977, about a year and a half after he starts working for NBC, the helicopter crashes after running out of gas. It kills him and the cameraman that are on board. So that was a very quick overview of what Dad went through, what happened when he came home.
That is just a crazy series of events. Now, obviously, you were, just being born? How old were you when your dad passed?
Yeah, well, Dad was shot down in 60. He was exchanged in 62, meets my mom at the CIA headquarters back in 63. They marry. I'm then born in 1965. So I am 12 years old in 1977 when my father dies in the helicopter crash.
That must have been incredibly difficult. How much were you even aware of all this when you were growing up? Like when you're like, a kid or a teenager?
Oh, sure. No, I was aware of it from a young age. I mean, in middle school, high school, I was aware of it before my father passed.
Mm-hmm.
But normal. I thought everybody's dad went through something like this. That perception changed on August 1st when he passes away in the helicopter crash. That's when I realized, not everybody's dad gets shot down, imprisoned, or exchanged for a Soviet spy. But at the time, I'm 12, 13, 15 years old. I don't understand why people want to talk to me about it. They ask me questions. I don't know the answers as a kid,
Mm-hmm.
so I don't want to. In college, I come out of my shell. I'm curious, want to find out the truth of what took place. Therefore, I could answer questions. So I start doing this research, going to the library, looking at periodicals, magazines, books, all the misinformation of the time in the newspapers about what my dad should or should not have done. And so over 30 plus years of research, I end up writing 3 books, helping to set the record straight. I founded a Cold War museum to honor Cold War veterans, preserve Cold War history, educate kids on the time period. And now I'm starting to lead Cold War espionage tours to Europe and doing spy tours of Washington, D.C.
Boy, what a dramatic change in the azimuth of your life. Just sort of, you want to see what really happened. And all of a sudden, you had a path in life to follow. Obviously, it wasn't flying U-2s or, the follow-on aircraft, but it was definitely a insight and a almost like a quest to figure out what in the world actually happened, because I'm sure half the records were classified or not able to be accessed until many years later. What was that process like for you as you're researching the book, researching what actually happened, both using US and Soviet records, and then the wall fell and records become available? And how did that go?
Well, I started my research back when I was in college. So this would have been about 84, 85. And at first, I'm getting the periodicals, the newspapers, the books that have been written up until that time. I moved to Virginia in 1992. I do my graduate degree in public administration from George Mason University. I start to do more research at the National Archives and with the retirement groups associated with the CIA or the FBI or NSA or NRO, all these government agencies that have something to do with the U2 program. So I also start to do Freedom of Information Act requests through the U.S. Air Force, through the CIA and other agencies, trying to find out exactly what took place.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened, and fortunate, in 1998, there's a declassification conference hosted by the CIA and the U.S. Air Force at Fort McNair in Washington, D.C. I go and I attend this conference. I help to set up a small exhibit from facts we've collected through the museum. And as a result of this declassification conference, I get the proceedings, the transcripts of what was declassified. In that, two very important things. One is that the altitude my father was shot down, 70,500 feet. 1998, that's when that altitude was declassified. Up until that time, it was classified. Conspiracy theorists thought, oh, he had a flame out. It was a descent. It was sabotage. There's no way those Russians can have those missiles. Well, they did.
Mm-hmm.
And it was finally declassified in 1998 that Dad was shot down at his assigned altitude. There was no descent or sabotage beforehand. The other thing that was really important is that it was the U2 program was a CIA Air Force collaboration. One could not be separated from the other. It was not a civilian program, as the U.S. government always maintained up through 1998. It was a military operation. And once that word military was declassified, that allowed the U.S. government to step up to the plate, honor Dad as a hero to our country. Prior to this declassification conference, the CIA ran the program. Civilians are not entitled to military decorations. Civilians don't get awarded a POW medal or things like that, because even though they're incarcerated, it's a civil operation. But once that word military was declassified and the U2 program became a military operation, the U.S. government could come up, correct the records, set the records straight, and they honored Dad as a hero to our country in 2000 with the POW medal and in 2012 with the Silver Star.
So was he actually in the Air Force at the time?
Well, this is okay. It depends on when you're talking. In 1950s, he was sheep dipped from the Air Force, took on a civilian capacity working for the CIA as a government employee, but not an Air Force fighter pilot or an Air Force pilot. Mm-hmm. He was a civilian CIA. Now you jump forward to 1998, declassification, he was a military pilot.
Right. So in reality, he was still on the Air Force's books. They just sort of moved him over to another file. You're a civilian now. You're working for the agency. But in reality, he would not be flying the U-2 without, being a military pilot.
Correct. And basically what is happening is the U-2 pilots are sheep dipped out. They become a civilian working for the government. And then after their 4-year or 6-year stint, they can go back into the military at a rank comparable to their peers with no loss of duty time. So for all intent and purposes, it was a military operation.
And that's what it sounds like in reality. It took many, many years to recognize and to fix those errors, I guess. They weren't really errors. You have to keep up the fiction to be consistent, I suppose, until it's declassified, and then they can fix things. But yeah, that's the sort of the pros and cons of taking these kinds of assignments. That's it sounds like a very exciting thing for your dad to do. But at the same time, obviously it was not the best of times, because he got shot down and they had a hole in the missile that we didn't know about. And they shot a lot of them. It wasn't like a one and done, was it?
No, well, two things I want to touch on here is if it was a military plane and a military pilot flying over the Soviet Union in the 1950s, that would have been an act of war. That's why it had to be a civilian program at the time. But jump forward 38, 40 years, the Cold War is over, enough time has passed, they can now declassify that it was a military operation. In regards to my father and how he felt flying these planes, it was a lot of excitement. He was part of the action. He was doing something patriotic for his country. He was, the red-blooded young American apple pie baseball Chevrolet type of guy. He wasn't cocky, though. He didn't have a chip on his shoulder. He was a professional. He did his job. He did it well.
So even though all this happened, was he ever bitter?
Bitter. Some people have said that about him. You could say he was bitter. You could say he was disappointed in some aspects.
Mm-hmm.
He always thought that the U.S. government back in the 1962 era, when he came back home and after he was shot down, could have done just a little more to help clear his name, just a little more to set the record straight at the time than waiting, 40 plus years to set the record straight. But he understood the mission. He understood the Cold War mentality. He understood what happens when a young man is caught up in what he's doing through no fault of his own. Someone has to be a scapegoat sometimes. Easier to blame the pilot than to admit we were behind the Soviet missile technology. Easier to blame the pilot than to further embarrass a U.S. president. So he understood the overall reasons behind why things happened the way they did. He just thought the government should have done a little bit more to help repair his reputation sooner than later.
I think everybody that has served in the military has encountered that in some small fashion. Somebody has to take the hit for what happened, whether it's a wrecked vehicle or, getting shot down over foreign airspace. The old saying, shit rolls downhill, definitely applies in the military. I've seen it many times myself. So I could see where you could recognize it and understand it, but not necessarily like it. I would imagine that's where your dad was at.
Basically, yes. I mean, he just thought they could have done a little bit more at the time. But because of political reasons and Cold War mentality, he knew why they couldn't.
So let's go to the Cold War mentality a little bit. And I don't think people really understand what that means. Like, you hear about it and we see the movies and I saw the Tom Hanks movie. I'm a junkie for these things. But if you haven't seen it or if you watched it and you don't really understand the environment, what was the Cold War mentality? How would you describe that?
Well, the Cold War mentality. We were fearful of the Soviet Union. We were thinking they were going to do a nuclear strike. We thought that they had spies in all of our government agencies and all of our buildings around the U.S. District of Columbia. It was a space race, an arms race, a missile gap, a bomber gap. It was better dead than red was the slogan at the time. It was communism versus democracy. Back in the 1946 to 1991 time period. Our primary nemesis was the Soviet Union, and it was the Soviets and the Americans that were playing this cat and mouse game back and forth, spying on each other, trying to gather their strengths and weaknesses, trying to find out as much as they could about their adversary to prepare for a nuclear war. And this was the time period where duck and cover drills would be held so that school children would duck under their desks in the event of a nuclear bomb dropping in their city. Now, today, we know that's a little absurd because if you are at ground zero, you're going to be dead. But if you're 5 miles out, 10 miles out, and you duck and cover under a desk or in a hallway, you might actually live through the first blast of this bomb. But then you have to worry about fallout. So back in the 50s, there was a big push to build fallout shelters in libraries, public schools, government office buildings, and those who could afford it could build one in their basement. And that would allow you to live for a week or two as the fallout settled to the ground, and then enough time would pass where you could go back outside and not get nuclear contamination. So that's basically the Cold War mentality. MAD is another great symbol of the Cold War. Mutually assured destruction. MAD. Nuclear war is MAD. Mutually assured destruction.
And that was talking about if the U.S. or the Soviets were to launch nuclear weapons, the other side would also launch nuclear weapons and everybody would be vaporized essentially.
Correct. And another slogan from the time period, one nuclear bomb can ruin your whole day.
Well, yes, one nuclear bomb can ruin your whole day. That's a very true statement. So the big takeaway about this is everybody in the whole country was aware of this. It was a part of a lot of conversations. It was a huge part of the entire U.S. government's efforts, both with the Soviet Union, but everywhere around the world, trying to contain the Soviet threat.
Correct. The domino theory, another aspect of the Cold War. We were thinking that communism was going to take over country after country after country like dominoes falling in a line. And so there was a containment strategy put in place in the 50s, I want to say under Truman, to contain the spread of communism. Hence why the Korean War breaks out in 1950. The Soviets are backing one side, we're backing another. We're trying to prevent the spread of communism. They're trying to prevent the spread of democracy. Same thing in Vietnam. Then you have the Afghan War with the Soviets. Then you have, these other conflicts, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U-2 incident, that all compose this Cold War time period with the events and activities that were taking place.
It's very interesting. I was looking through the Cold War Museum that you started, and you had a recent talk, I guess it was last year, about Arthur Nicholson. And I work in a facility named after Arthur Nicholson. So I was like, oh, I know that name. I know his story. In fact, we have one of the tanks that he was inspecting at the time, Lieutenant Colonel Nicholson, in front of our building as a reminder of the dangers that go into the Cold War.
Oh, yes. I just got back from a 10-day Cold War espionage tour of Germany and the Czech Republic. And on that tour, we went by the United States Military Liaison Mission headquarters. We went by the location where Nicholson was shot at the Berlin Wall and left to bleed out. Horrible, horrible circumstances. We could have, had we been able to get over the wall to get him, saved his life. But the Stasi, the police there in East Germany at the time, wouldn't allow anybody to go and help him. It was a tragedy back in the 80s that happened. I might be superimposing 60s or 80s, but I thought it was the 80s when that happened.
It was in the 80s. But yeah, it's just because I happen to be fully aware of his story because of the name. The building I work in is named after him, and there's a whole bunch of materials at the front describing his story, and the newspaper articles, the Stars and Stripes, and all the things of that time when he was shot, and the outrage at it, because it was brutal and unnecessary. And it was, just one of those things that happened. Just somebody overreacted and boom, big international incident. But that was the tensions of the time. And I think that's sort of what people need to take out of this, is that everybody was assuming the worst at all times. And there was good reason to, because both sides were spying like heck on each other and trying to figure out what they were doing and what resources and what military capabilities they had and what their intentions were. And there was not a good time. So let's talk about the Cold War Museum.
I founded the museum in 1996 to honor Cold War veterans, preserve Cold War history, educate kids on this time period. I had just moved out to the Washington, D.C. area in 92. I'm doing my graduate degree at George Mason University. I start to give lectures to high school students in Fairfax County, Washington, D.C., about the Cold War and the U-2 incident. 9 times out of 10, I'd walk into a classroom, sometimes AP history. I'd get blank stares from the kids. They thought I was there to talk about the U-2 rock band, not the U-2 incident. And I realized right away that something had to be done to preserve Cold War history. So in 96, I founded the museum. I thought it would take 3 years. These $3 million shouldn't be too hard to do. Took 15 years to get brick and mortar. And over that time period, we started to collect Cold War artifacts. Very easy to find in the mid to late 90s, very hard to find today. So we were ahead of the curve when we started collecting these items. As a result of the collection we've assembled, we've got artifacts from the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U-2 incident, overhead reconnaissance platforms such as the KH and or Corona spy satellite, the SR-71. We have items from civil defense, We rescued the Civil Defense Headquarters for Washington, D.C. We were able to collect all of the artifacts from within the bunker in Lorton, Virginia. That's now either in storage or on display at the museum. We have items from Vint Hill. That's where we're located. Vint Hill Farm Station was a listening post located 45 miles west of Washington, D.C., operational from World War II up through the mid-90s. Basically, used to have a lot of antennae fields, gathering international signals, signal intelligence, SIGINT, electric intelligence, ELINT. They would have some of their radars and their antennas focused on Washington, D.C. to pick up the embassy communications. So it was basically a listening post operated by NSA, CIA, and Army Security Agency. So fortunately, we were able to grab this building, one of many on site, 2,000 square foot. We opened in 2011. We have another 2,000 square feet of storage behind the museum that's packed full of boxes waiting to eventually find a bigger home. And we help to honor our veterans, preserve the history, and educate the kids. More information online, coldwar.org.
I bet you were really lucky to get that domain address because, it's so perfect. It's like coldwar.org, boom, makes sense. It's hard sometimes these days.
I applied for that domain in 1996.
So that was pretty early. I bet it was pretty open.
Oh, yeah. I tried to get coldwar.com, and somebody had taken it. I'm going, oh, no. Well, it was Ted Turner. He bought that domain for his 24-part series called The Cold War. So when I realized that he had taken that domain name, and I'm in the process of starting the Cold War Museum, okay, I'm onto something. This is good. I'm in at the right time. And we were able to, be the first Cold War museum in the world.
That is fantastic. I bet you were pretty excited, like, hey, there's going to be a whole thing. Maybe we could tie in or, at least get some interest in the Cold War.
Oh, I pitched the government agencies. I pitched military veterans. I pitched anybody who would listen to, hey, we need to do this. And some people would listen, and some people said, oh, no, we got other things to worry about now.
I'm sure. And it takes a while for history to become history, I suppose. When you're first starting, it was still fresh.
Exactly. Enough time has to pass in order for it to gain interest. And right now is a prime example of that. We have the Chinese weather balloon flying over the U.S. Weather balloon, wink, wink. We've got Russia with the invasion of Ukraine, a war in a proxy country, the East backing one side, the West backing the other, just like Vietnam and Korea. It is a Cold War all over again. Cold War 2.0.
Isn't that crazy?
Yes.
What is old is new again, and in the former Soviet Union, now the Russian state and the Chinese are still communist. The autocrats in Russia pushing a war. The domain may have changed a little bit, but I can tell you I know for sure that the nuclear fears are still there. But at the same time, people aren't reacting to it. We've been at war for 20 years and it barely affects, or if you're a regular American, you probably aren't even aware of it. Back in the 50s and 60s, it was everybody's mind all the time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was front and center. When I was first starting the Cold War Museum in 96, I called around to anybody I could, including a retired KGB friend that I have in Moscow. And she said, okay, Gary, I'll run this up the flagpole. I'll see what they say. I was asking, any artifacts that they could loan that we could get to put on display to show their side of the story. Mm-hmm. And so she comes back to me in a couple of months and goes, Gary, this is what they told me. They said, he will get no help from us. The Cold War is not over. Very prophetic.
When was this?
1996, 97.
Okay, yeah, it was still going.
Well, it was over, quote unquote, but not in their mind.
Right. Yeah, it was the same people in the same job still sitting there going, no, it's not. We're not done yet.
Yep. Exactly.
So you've been running this museum, and it's in Vint Hill. And if you are a history buff, if you've read any books about the NSA or about the CIA or SIGINT involved in any way. And it has a unique positioning to be between where Europe is and where all the embassies in DC are, so it can capture all these signals. Vint Hill was a very famous place, and now there's all sorts of condos and all sorts of other buildings. It's a suburb of DC, even though it's 45 minutes out. I go by it all the time just because I go up Route 29 from Charlottesville to DC. And so I drive right by Vint Hill. And every time I do, I'm like, oh, yes, I know exactly, all these stories come to mind. W.B. Griffin had it figure prominently in a number of his stories, and Tom Clancy as well. It's one of those famous things. So you're able to get a place there. When are you open?
Well, the best time to go is on the weekends, and we're open between, I think, 11 and 4 on Saturdays and noon and 4 on Sundays. But the website, coldwar.org, has the hours listed there. If you can't make it by on the weekend, give them a call. Oftentimes, they can open up midweek with an appointment for school groups or other people who can't get there on the weekend. But if you get there on the weekend, we are located right between Vint Hill Craft Winery and Old Busthead Brewery. So it's a great weekend out, and you go over, you have a beer, have a glass of wine, have a taco from the taco truck at one of the sites, and then come into the museum to walk around and listen to the docents talk about Cold War history and give you a guided tour of the complex.
That's pretty awesome. I mean, it's like you have the best of both worlds. You got the brewery, winery, boom, go see some history, and then, go have a great weekend. So you've got it going, and you guys have lots of materials, I'm sure. What are some of the things people would see in the museum?
Well, one of the rooms that we take them to first is the Vint Hill room. And we have one of the radio receivers and monitors that were used to monitor these incoming signals from around the world. We have vintage photos of the base in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that show how it was operational at the time. We have one of the sections set up with a little Morse code, so you're listening to a Morse code come in across the broadcasting frequency. And then we take you through to a little section on the U-2 incident, a section on civil defense, a section on the SR-71, reconnaissance, some of the film from the Corona or the KH satellites, one of the stereograph tables with some film on it. You can look down and see how interpreters would see the missiles or the bombers on the tarmac. You go upstairs, and there's a variety of displays on the Miracle on Ice, the 1980 Olympics in which we won against the Soviet Union in ice hockey. We have a display on the USS Liberty incident, some items from the USS Pueblo incident. We have flags, banners, regalia, a couple of weapons from various countries around the world, East Bloc and West Bloc countries from the Cold War, and then just a whole hodgepodge of different artifacts, imagery, uniforms, regalia that is typical of the Cold War time period.
That sounds like a wonderful weekend, especially in DC or right around DC. It's close enough to DC that I would call it DC, even though it's in Virginia. That whole area, it's like from Fredericksburg north. It's all DC to me. I used to be in DC for many years, and I moved out because the traffic's insane. But Charlottesville is just down the street, and so I'm up there more often than I would like. But I definitely go by it all the time. So I have not been, so I'm gonna have to swing by and make plans to go visit the Cold War Museum. So Gary, you've also written several books, and I think that's important to talk about, because if you want to find out more, there's nothing like having a good resource, a good book that breaks things into detail and provides all these resources. Let's talk about some of your books. Your most recent one is what?
Well, the one that just came out last year, August 2022, is called Enemy Territory, and it is a graphic novel, basically a comic book that looks like a book.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to do a graphic novel to target a younger generation. Kids, they don't like to read, they like comic books. What better way to teach kids about the U-2 incident than through a comic book? So I am working on other comic book type of graphic novels now, one on the Cold War, one on the Berlin Wall, one on the Bay of Pigs, one on the Cuban Missile Crisis. So over the next 5 years, I'm going to have a series of Cold War graphic novels catered to a younger generation to teach them about the Cold War. So that's the latest book that came out. My first book came out in 2017, Letters from a Soviet Prison. During my research into finding out more about my father, I was able to collect about 85 of his letters to his family and then another 85 or more answers back to him in prison. So I was able to transcribe these letters. In 2017, I assembled them, got help from a friend. We put this into a self-publishing mode, and we were able to self-publish Letters from a Soviet Prison in 2017. Over the next 2 years, I worked on another book with another co-author called Spy Pilot, Francis Gary Powers, the U-2 Incident, and a Controversial Cold War Legacy. That was actually published through a publisher. It went on the lecture circuit with them for about a year, right before COVID happened. But this book is the accumulation of my 30 plus years of research. It sets the record straight. It takes Dad's reputation from infamy and controversy in the 60s to that of an American hero today. It goes through the behind the scenes process as to how he was ultimately posthumously awarded the POW medal and the Silver Star. It's the truth of what took place. I debunked the conspiracy theories. I squelched the misinformation. It's the truth of what took place based on the 30 plus years of research that I did. So those are the 3 books I have out currently.
So if you guys are interested, I'm going to give a little plug. You can go find them on Amazon. Super easy. Just, put in Francis Gary Powers, search, and you'll find tons of books, including these books, but especially these. From a history perspective, the ability to read all those letters, the correspondence, which gets lost and, disregarded over time, lost to the vagaries of history or someone moving and tossing out stuff, to get, dozens and dozens of these letters, it really provides an insight into what was going on in your dad's mind and in the minds of the people he was writing to. But then it's somewhat constrained because he also knows that probably every letter he writes is going to be read by the Soviets.
Yes, correct. So yeah, Dad was able to write these letters home. It was his lifeline to his family, to his loved ones. He did not want to do anything to jeopardize that privilege of writing home to his family and receiving letters from them. It's a primary source book. And that's one of the main reasons I wanted to publish his letters, is so that students, scholars, professors in the future that are doing reports or doing research could read his written words, his thoughts, his feelings, his hopes, his despairs while incarcerated in the Soviet Union. And that's why I did that first book, is to get his letters out there for public consumption.
So just on a personal note, as you're reading these letters, what were you thinking? What were you feeling?
Boy, it was a little surreal. I mean, I'm reading these letters that my father wrote from prison, some of his innermost feelings. You could see the emotional roller coaster ride he was dealing with. There would be periods of very happy and I'm going to be exchanged. I'm going to go free. I'm going to get out of here tomorrow. That didn't happen. And then the next letter would be very depressed, very solemn. You could see that it was taking a mental toll on him the longer he was in prison. So that was a very unique thing for me to learn, is that the mental strain that my father had incarcerated.
It must have been very surreal, is a great word. I mean, your dad had passed at this point, in the helicopter crash. You were a young man when he passed. He probably didn't talk with you about all these things very much, or just like most, when you're dealing with older veterans, they keep a lot of things in. They don't talk about all their experiences. And then all of a sudden you're reading all this and you're saying the innermost thoughts and, the thought processes as well.
No, yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm reading things in the letters. He's talking about he wants a family. And, here I am.
Right.
So I'm what he was thinking of prison. So that was very unique to read that and ponder on it.
So then you wrote Spy Pilot, which I think is a great book. It's certainly well reviewed. What was your goal? I mean, obviously you're trying to set the record straight and you had great source material. And I do have one question before I go further. Were you ever able to get information from the Soviet archives?
I was able to get some through some associates, friends, colleagues who were doing research over there in 91, 92, 93, after the fall of the wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
The book that I'm going to reference, I don't know the author offhand, Naftali, I want to say, but his book was Khrushchev's Cold War. And the two authors, one American, one Russian, were able to get into the archives and get some information pertaining to the U-2 incident that they were able to publish. So it basically lined up with what my father always said. He never wavered from, I was at my assigned altitude, 8 missiles were fired, they captured me, et cetera, et cetera. So it turns out that the Soviet version is pretty much similar to what Dad has always maintained, which was a good thing to find out.
Isn't that amazing? It took so many years to see the other side of the story. It must have been quite amazing for you to actually see this, because you'd started all this research many years before.
Right. I started the research probably in about 84, 85 or so, and then got serious in 92, 93 when I moved to the D.C. area. And then from there, it just snowballed. And so, I founded the Cold War Museum. I've written these 3 books. I've got more books in the pipeline. I'm running spy tours of Washington. If any groups of 30 or more are interested, you can go to spytour.com and find out what we're doing. I do lectures across the country and internationally. So if any of your listeners that are looking for a guest speaker to come out for a half hour or an hour program to a reunion group, a military group, a retirement facility, library, schools, I'm always looking for venues, especially in Virginia where I live.
Yes.
But got to plug Virginia.
Absolutely.
And, it's just a very rewarding experience to not only, honor my dad and help set his reputation straight, but to honor all Cold War veterans and recognize them for their service to our country.
So the last thing I'm going to ask you about is consulting for the movie. What was that like?
Back in 2015, Steven Spielberg directs this movie called Bridge of Spies. It stars Tom Hanks as James Donovan. James Donovan is the attorney who represented the Soviet spy Rudolf Abel after his capture in the United States in the mid-50s. He is also the attorney that brokered the exchange between the Soviet spy and my father that resulted in the exchange on February 10th, 1962 at the Glendicker Bridge in Potsdam, Germany. So this movie depicts Rudolf Abel's capture, depicts my father's shoot down and imprisonment, and then the ultimate exchange at the bridge in 62. Back in 2014, I started to hear rumors that Spielberg was going to do this movie. And I'm thinking, he's not going to do this movie. Why would he do this movie? There's no reason for him to do this movie. Well, then I find out he's going to do it. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I need to, reach out to Mr. Spielberg and let him know what the family thinks here. So I write an email to some of his associates. I find their email addresses online and basically say, hello, Gary Powers Jr. would like to talk to Mr. Spielberg about this movie that will depict my father. Very important that we express the Powers family's concerns. If he bases the portrayal of Dad on the misinformation, the fake news of the time, they'll be painting him in a negative light. If they base it off the declassified information that's come to surface the last 50 plus years, they'll be painting him as a hero to our country. So for obvious reasons, I wanted to reach out and establish contact.
Mm-hmm.
As a result of that email, I get a phone call from the producer. He and I talked for an hour in June of 2014. The end of the conversation, he goes, hey, Gary, you're very knowledgeable on the Cold War, the U-2 incident, what your father went through. How would you like to consult for the film? Oh, yeah, that would be really nice. Thank you. So I ended up being a consultant on the film. It was an honor and a privilege to work with Mr. Spielberg, Mr. Hanks, the crew, the cameramen, the staff, and everybody who put this production together. Very unique experience to be behind the scenes, watching director Spielberg, lights, action, camera, redo, where's this guy looking, redo this scene, this is out of place, watching him do his magic. Very, very wonderful experience to have been able to do.
And what did you think about the movie and the accuracy? Obviously, you were involved in the process, and so it's going to be more true to life than it might have been otherwise. So what did you think about the movie when it was all said and done?
Well, yes and no. It's Hollywood, right?
Right.
So the big picture is accurate. There's a U-2 incident, there's a Soviet spy, there's a Cold War, there's tensions between the Soviets and the Americans. We're fearful of a nuclear war. The big picture is very, very well done. But it's Hollywood. They embellish. They use dramatic effect. They take artistic liberties. So while the big picture is accurate, The details of each scene are not 100% correct. There's some misinformation in the movie. There's some fake news that made it into the movie, but that is what was being talked about and said during the time period. So it accurately portrays the time period, but again, the details are not 100% accurate.
Right, because we have the benefit of hindsight now, but what they
Exactly.
knew then and what we know now are two different things.
Exactly.
Well, Gary, thank you so much for joining us on Coming Home Well. I always ask this, and I didn't warn you in advance. I normally do. I just slip my mind. But what should I have asked you about but didn't?
Oh, boy. What should they have asked me about but didn't?
And I got to apologize because I normally warn my guests before we talk that I'm going to ask them this question, and I didn't do that today. But I got to know because sometimes I just forget to ask things. And so if this is a open anything you want to talk about that I should have asked about.
Well, you pretty much covered the Cold War, the U-2 incident, what I've done with the museum, my books, the tours, what I'm doing now. A couple of things to add in just for the last minute. If anybody wants to reach me, they can get me through garypowers.com. You can send me an email through my contact form there. I am always looking for lecture venues to talk about Cold War history and or the U-2 incident. I will be up at Oshkosh, Wisconsin in July for their big air show, the week of July 23rd through 30th, I believe it is. So I'll be there at the Kid Venture, talking to kids about the U-2 incident, talking about the book, The Enemy Territory, which is the graphic novel, because kids love graphic novels. I will be around the country at various locations. You can get to my webpage and look under the events to find out where I'm going to be. And if I'm going to be in your neighborhood, if I'm going to be in your city, you'd like me to do another lecture or presentation, please reach out to me. I'd love to talk about Cold War history and the need to honor the veterans, preserve the history, and educate the kids.
Gary, again, thank you so much for joining us on Coming Home Well. I love history because, as the military goes, we look back and try to learn from people who have gone before us and sort of understand the environment in which decisions are made. Because, in retrospect, you'd be like, why did they make that decision? Or why would they do that? Because you don't understand the environment in which they're operating. And so we try to make better decisions now. We've evolved a lot of things because of this insight. But at the same time, we aren't always the best about history, as much as we would like to be, because there's so much of it. But then, that's why I love having history discussions on the show. And this has been really enlightening. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Tyler, it was great. Thanks for having me on.
You've been listening to Coming Home Well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for joining us this week on Coming Home Well with Dr. Tyler Piron. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and a review. Thanks again. And until all are home and all are well, this is Coming Home Well.